Our topic is origination points of games. And of course there are lots of different origination points, which I've listed here, and then I'll talk about each one individually. Very commonly for video games and sometimes for tabletop role-playing games, the origination point is some kind of experience or look and feel. What do you want the players to feel? Often this will be a game where the player has an avatar, frequently a person, occasionally something like a tank or a spaceship. The player identifies with that avatar, and what happens to that avatar in effect happens to the player. The designer may have an image of an event or an action in mind, and that's often related to a story. For example, the rhythm games clearly wanted players to feel like they were rock stars. Some of those games have a story more or less, some of them do not. They're just rock star games. A term that is often used for this kind of thing is a theme, but a theme can relate to the setting of a game more than to the specific experiences of the players. Sometimes we have an atmosphere, which is the trappings of the setting or the look and feel, but these trappings don't affect how the game was designed or how it's played. So it's very lackluster. Many games originate specifically with a story or with history, and most people are familiar with historical war games. RPGs again often originate with a story. Now, by story I don't mean a narrative. Every game has a narrative, which is an account of what happens. Everything you do in life has a narrative. It's an account of what happened, but frequently it won't be of interest to anyone but you, or you and your family. Well, a story is something that's explicitly imposed on the game by the designer or designers. Sometimes this is history. It can be history that can be changed, of course, and sometimes it's stories, often science fiction or fantasy related. Unfortunately, games are not a good means to tell a story compared to movies and plays and novels, because stories are linear. The author controls what happens, and many games are not linear, and if they are linear, some players don't like it. Players want to control what happens. What games do have going for them is that they can look very cinematic nowadays, and they have much more flexibility than actual cinema. And that's probably the reason why stories in games are so popular these days. Another way for a game to originate is in mechanics. What's the mechanism that characterizes the game? I recall listening to one speaker at a conference whose mechanism was roping space sheep. Now in the end, he had to throw out the roping mechanism for a herding mechanism. So his entire mechanism had changed, but nonetheless he'd pursued the game. Fortunately, he was self-critical enough to see that if he tried to hold on to that roping mechanism, the game would not work, and so he abandoned it. Rules and mechanics are closely related. Rules describe how mechanics work. And another term for mechanics is mechanisms, and that may be a better term, but mechanics is shorter, and that's what most people use. Abstract games may be, usually are, mechanics and nothing else. And frequently, if it's a fully abstract game, the mechanics are very simple, as in checkers, or chess, or tic-tac-toe. But even complex video games often amount to just one or two major mechanics. Another way that a game might originate is components. This is more likely for a tabletop game. It could be a particular kind of piece. I once designed a game where I wanted to use the small glass beads that are often sold for decorating plant displays and so on. I wanted to use those in a game, and I made the game, and the game's under contract, but it won't have the glass beads because they're too heavy to ship. They cost too much to ship. Oh well. The component can be pseudo-physical. For example, you could have a version of Magic the Gathering on computer, so the components are still cards, but they're cards in the computer. And a component could be something like a particular kind of controller. Kinect, Move, Wii controllers. You might wonder if the guitar controllers in Rock Band and these other games are in fact a case where the components were the origination of the game, but evidently no, it was the experience of being a rock star that was the origination of the game, and then the components were invented to match that vision. Another very common way for a game to originate is it derives from another game or from a game system. And of course, we know that an awful lot of video games nowadays are sequels of other video games. So they clearly derive from the previous game. But this happens in tabletop games as well. So there are a number of games that use many of the mechanisms that I devised for Britannia. So we can call them Britannia-like games. Diplomacy is a game where there are a great number of variants. But you can talk about chess variants, Call of Duty variants, or Call of Duty-like games, Diablo 2-like games like Torchlight, and so forth. The most common, perhaps, way that games originate in the video game world is via genre. Somebody says, well, I'm going to make an RTS game, a real-time strategy game, or I'm going to make an adventure game, or I'm going to make an action game, or I'm going to make a first-person shooter. And that immediately identifies many of the characteristics of the game as well as the target audience. Now, video game genres are about what the player does. Tabletop game genres are about how the game presents itself and is manipulated. So you have card games, board games, role-playing games, and so on. Whereas in video games, you have games that are FPS because FPS's first-person shooters all work the same way. What the player does is essentially the same. So each genre comes with player expectations and designer constraints. And constraints in general is a way that games can originate. I'm convinced that artists of any kind do better work when they're working within a set of rules. That doesn't mean they always pay attention to the set of rules. Beethoven broke rules, but he was Beethoven. He could do it. And most of the time he followed the rules just like anybody else. The same for painters, sculptors, and so on. In periods when there are no rules, then you tend not to get great work. Like modern painting, there are no rules, and as far as I'm concerned, there's no great work. So where do these rules or constraints come from? They can be self-imposed. Like I can say, I want to make a game, but it can't be longer than an hour. They can be publisher imposed. This is particularly true for tabletop games. Say your publisher always uses 10.5 by 10.5 boxes, so your board has to be a multiple of that size to fit in the box. There are market imposed constraints. Nowadays, people like games with plastic pieces. However, because of budget constraints, there are not many games with plastic pieces because they cost too much to produce in small quantities. There are limitations of the genre. If you're making a real-time strategy game, then you have to think very carefully about turning it into a game where an individual avatar does most of the work. Real-time strategy games generally are about large number of units and about production. So there can be lots and lots of constraints, and a designer picks some of those constraints, or the publisher picks some of those constraints, or the client picks some of those constraints if you're designing a game for a client. And you have to work with them. And of course, many games start with more than one of these origination points.